Hello, and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Rail Program Delivery video series. I'm Anthony Thomas, and I'm pleased to introduce Peter Schwartz, Senior Transportation Planner with the FRA.
Hi everyone.
In this video, you will learn about service planning, part of the project development process. We will walk you through the various elements of service planning, how those elements should be sequenced, and how to document the activities performed and decisions made in a service development plan.
During service planning, you'll determine the characteristics of a new or improved rail service that will best meet the purpose and need of the project, identify the resources required to implement and operate that service, and make a case for implementing the proposed service. This process involves determining the scope, costs, benefits, and other elements of the project in enough detail to support a decision as to whether or not to fund and implement it.
Service planning marks the transition from conducting high-level feasibility analysis to a detailed transportation planning effort. Service planning, though an iterative process, can be very sensitive to even minor changes, assumptions, or methodology. Addressing things up front will save you potential conflicts down the line in environmental review, preliminary engineering, final design, construction, and in the ongoing operation of the service.
It's also essential that service planning meets the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. In particular, the decisions made during service planning directly support the identification and analysis of alternatives and the evaluation of impacts to transportation resources that is undertaken as part of the NEPA process.
So when does service planning start? Service planning begins when a project sponsor decides to seriously commit to pursuing implementation of a new or improved rail service. Under FRA's rail planning framework, the service should ideally be identified as a part of a regional rail plan and incorporated into the appropriate state rail plans. When you start service planning, you won't have much more than a general description of the objectives of the new or improved service. The service planning process will take you from a vague description of the project all the way to a detailed service and investment proposal for which you can seek funding.
This information is eventually documented in a Service Development Plan, or SDP. As the project gets further refined and conditions change, you'll continue to update the SDP until construction is complete and the service is up and running. We'll talk more about SDPs later.
Let's get into the details of what service planning entails. There are several sequential elements that make up the service planning process, which include rationale, goals, and objectives, identification of preliminary service alternatives, planning methodology, market analysis and demand forecasting, operations analysis, station and access analysis, conceptual engineering and capital programming, operating and maintenance costs and capital replacement forecasting, and public benefits analysis. Remember, service planning is iterative, meaning that you may need to revisit earlier elements in the process if subsequent analysis leads to previously unanticipated conclusions or findings. And because each project is unique, the amount of work needed to develop a successful service development plan is relative to the size, scope, and complexity of your specific project.
We've created a hypothetical example to help illustrate the steps and iterative nature of service planning. A regional rail plan identified a need for intercity passenger rail service in a corridor extending between the town of Reading and Blue Springs, a city 200 miles to the south, due to the high level of highway and airport congestion within that corridor, and forecasts which indicated that travel will increase over the coming years. We'll now walk through each of the elements of service planning, using this example as a guide.
Rationale, goals, and objectives. The rationale is the foundation of service planning. It should convey why implementing the proposed rail service is needed, taking into account projected opportunities and challenges presented by the market it would serve.
The rationale should consider current and forecasted travel demand and capacity conditions across all modes of transportation within that market. It should describe the transportation challenges and opportunities in that market and outline the goals and objectives of the proposed service as they relate to addressing those challenges and realizing those opportunities. The rationale, goals, and objectives should closely mirror the purpose and needs statement developed as part of the NEPA process.
Identification of preliminary alternatives. You will then identify an initial range of service alternatives that could accomplish the project's goals and objectives. In many cases, a preliminary range of service alternatives will have been identified as part of earlier planning studies, such as regional rail plans or feasibility studies. The preliminary alternative should include a base case, which includes the transportation network as it currently exists, plus any changes that are committed to be completed before the horizon year you are using to plan your project. For large projects, the range of service alternatives may include improvements to modes of transportation other than rail.
A service alternative will generally be identified by the characteristics that largely determine the role it would play within the transportation market. These include the route the service will operate over, the communities it'll stop at, the frequency of the service, and the travel times it'll offer between the stations it serves. Our project example will help illustrate this point. In this example, we identified 5 service alternatives. First is the base case. Then we have 3 alternatives for new passenger rail service that would operate on an existing privately owned rail line which is currently used exclusively for freight service. The first has 2 round trips per day, making 10 stops between the 2 cities, operating at maximum speeds of 80 miles per hour, translating to an end-to-end trip time of 4.5 hours. The second also has 10 station stops, but has 6 round trips per day and a maximum speed of 90 miles per hour, with an end-to-end trip time of 4 hours even. The third is an express-oriented alternative, decreasing the number of intermediate station stops to 4, increasing the frequency to 10 round trips per day at a maximum speed of 110 miles per hour, resulting in an end-to-end trip time of 3.5 hours. The last alternative is for the construction of a new high-speed passenger railroad on state-owned right-of-way along the interstate. This alternative includes 16 round trips per day, 3 intermediate station stops, and operates at a top speed of 150 miles per hour with an end-to-end trip time of 2 hours and 45 minutes. However, because of the use of highway right-of-way, the stations would be located outside of the central business districts of all of the cities served. To make things simple, we'll walk through one service alternative to illustrate the service planning process. Alternative 3.
Planning methodology. The planning methodology describes the common assumptions and analytical approaches that will apply throughout the service planning process. The planning methodology should at a minimum include the planning horizon utilized. Your planning horizon should be closely correlated to the anticipated useful life of the capital investments required for the service. Any major cross-cutting assumptions used throughout the service planning process. You should make note of your sources for inputs like macroeconomic forecasts, fuel price forecasts, and inflation assumptions. Your approach for public participation in the service planning process. How do you plan on involving the general public? This should be closely coordinated with the public involvement required as a part of the NEPA process.
At various points during service planning, you'll find that your analysis indicates that a given service alternative would either simply not address the rationale, goals, and objectives of the project, or that an alternative doesn't represent a reasonable means of doing so. When you reach such a point for a given alternative, it's possible to eliminate it from further consideration in service planning. As part of your service planning methodology, you should identify the specific factors you'll consider, such as costs, ridership, and environmental impacts, in determining whether or not a given alternative is reasonable. However, if there's any uncertainty about whether or not an alternative is reasonable, you should err on the side of presuming it is reasonable until clearly proven otherwise.
Market analysis and demand forecasting. Next, you'll analyze the transportation market and conduct demand and revenue forecasts for the service alternatives that are under consideration. Here are the general steps for market analysis and demand forecasting. First, you will analyze the existing and projected characteristics of the transportation market you are looking to serve. This will help you establish context for the role that the proposed rail service will play in that market. It will also help you determine the factors that you'll consider in demand forecasting. Next, you will establish the methodology you will use in demand forecasting. This could involve building an entirely new demand forecasting model or using an existing model. Be sure to address how you will consider the role of capacity constraints from equipment or station access limitations. Then you'll identify the data sources for demand forecasting, including data on existing travel patterns and macroeconomic factors that influence travel demand. Finally, you'll need to document the structure and workings of your demand forecasting model, including the mathematical equations that underpin it, your assumptions regarding pricing and other factors, and its elasticities with respect to key factors like travel time, fare, and service frequency.
The results of your demand forecasting model should include the expected annual ridership, passenger miles, and ticket revenue, broken down by origin-destination pair, including summary results for the intermediate years between when the project begins operation and the planning horizon year, and forecasts for auxiliary revenue, including food and beverage, station concessions, and all other applicable revenue streams. In our example, the demand forecasts predict ridership of 900,000 passengers during the first year of operation, growing to 1.6 million passengers by the planning horizon year. With the assumed ticket prices, annual ticket revenues would be $60 million in the first year and $112 million in the planning horizon year.
Operations analysis. Next, you'll identify the physical resources required to operate your proposed rail service, while also mitigating the effect your new service will have on the operational performance of other rail services that may share the infrastructure you plan to use. The resources you'll identify include those needed to get the service up and running, like track, interlockings, signals, structures, and rolling stock, and those needed to keep it running on an ongoing basis, such as train crews, maintenance facilities, personnel, and other supporting infrastructure.
As part of operations analysis, you'll need to consider the detailed operating requirements of each service alternative, as represented in a timetable that reflects the operating characteristics of the service, including frequencies, travel times, and station stopping patterns, the characteristics of the specific types of passenger equipment you plan to use, and the consists they'll be assembled into. For service alternatives that would operate on existing rail lines, you'll need to determine the existing and forecasted operating characteristics for the other rail services that use those lines. Also, for services that would use existing rail lines, you'll need to obtain detailed information on the physical characteristics and existing design and condition of those rail lines. You'll need to establish infrastructure-related design assumptions that will be used in the operations analysis, such as assumed maximum cant efficiency in curves and signal rule conventions. You'll need to present detailed output from the operations analysis, addressing both proposed infrastructure changes and measures of operational performance. The infrastructure changes should be represented by detailed track charts and narrative descriptions of the proposed changes, while operational performance should be presented using both tabular output for metrics like train delay and velocity, and graphical outputs like stringline diagrams. In addition, you'll need to determine the total equipment and train crew resources required to operate each service alternative. And lastly, you'll need to identify requirements for platform tracks at stations, yard capacity at terminals, and maintenance of equipment facilities. Let's go back to our example. During operations analysis, it became clear that this alternative's high number of station stops would cause major delays for the freight traffic on the line that would be unreasonably expensive to mitigate by building out more capacity. However, the operations analysis indicated that removing 4 of the proposed 10 station stops would eliminate these conflicts. To evaluate this possible change, we need to go back and run it through the demand forecasting model to see what effect the reduction in stations would have on demand. This illustrates the iterative nature of service planning, where unforeseen outcomes mean that you have to revisit earlier elements of the analysis.
Station and access analysis. During this element, you will identify the physical resources necessary to provide a robust interface between the rail service, the communities it would serve, and the larger transportation system.
Station and access analysis relies on the forecasts of passenger boardings and alightings at each station, which were developed during market analysis and demand forecasting, to establish what facilities and design elements will be needed at each station. Station and access analysis also draws on the outputs of the operations analysis, specifically as it relates to the platform requirements at each station. For each station stop under consideration, you'll need to address station location preferences, including descriptions of land ownership and availability, station facility requirements, such as the number of platforms and their length, and station building requirements, including waiting room size, restroom, ticketing, and baggage handling facilities, and provisions for leasable retail space. Station access requirements for car parking, bicycle parking, local transit and intercity bus facilities, taxi queuing, and passenger drop-off and pickup areas, and station area integration, considering the nearby road, transit, bikeway, and pedestrian networks, and the existing and future development of the station area.
Conceptual engineering and capital programming. Using the results of your operations analysis and station and access analysis, you'll better define the physical resources required to operate the proposed service, as represented by a list of discrete capital projects. You'll establish how those capital projects will be implemented, including design, construction, and acquisition scheduling, cost estimates, and potential phasing of the proposed service improvements.
Conceptual engineering and capital programming entails the following. First, you'll translate identified physical improvements into a list of discrete capital projects. You'll develop conceptual cost estimates for each of the projects and summarize the total cost for all projects in FRA's standard cost categories format. You'll want to include a robust cost contingency in these estimates that reflects uncertainties inherent in a conceptual level of design. You'll develop a schedule for implementing the projects, including how long each will likely take to complete and how you will sequence them. Finally, you'll compile a set of conceptual engineering drawings. This should include basic visual depictions of the projects, including track charts and conceptual configurations of proposed stations. It should also include maps which show the locations of the various projects and other documentation used in developing the conceptual cost estimates, schedules, and phasing plans. Again, changing projects or objectives will get hard as the service moves towards implementation. It's important to be as forward-thinking as possible.
Operating and maintenance costs and capital replacement forecasting. This is where you'll get into more details about the cost to operate and maintain the proposed service. This element includes forecasted operating expenses for the service, including those for train and engine crews, onboard services, fuel, equipment maintenance, and station operations, among others. You'll make these estimates for the anticipated first year of the service's operation and then forecast them out to the planning horizon year. You'll then use these cost forecasts, together with the revenue forecasts developed in your market analysis and demand forecasting, to develop a profit or loss forecast for the route. Finally, you will develop estimates of additional capital expenditures that will need to be made between the anticipated start of operation and the planning horizon year in order to keep the service running. Some specific investments may have shorter lifespans and will need to be replaced before the horizon year.
This analysis should also address any cost-sharing arrangements with and access fees paid to or from the owners and other users of the infrastructure that would be used by the service. For our example, the operating and maintenance cost analysis shows that there will be an annual operating loss of $6.5 million in the first year, though it also shows that loss should decrease over the following years as demand for the service builds. If this alternative is selected, the project sponsors will need to identify a source for ongoing operating financial support for the service.
And finally, public benefits analysis. Here, you'll explore the overall economic impact of the proposal. This analysis should address the pros and cons of the project, such as operational benefits, travel time savings, air quality impacts, community development, and other user and non-user economic benefits. This process is informed by all of the preceding elements of service planning and highlights which alternatives provide more benefits than others.
By the time you've completed the public benefits analysis, you will have all the information needed to assess the transportation-related merits of all these service alternatives that remain under consideration. Together with the environmental analysis undertaken as part of the NEPA process, you'll be able to either select a single preferred alternative or possibly determine that none of the service alternatives merit implementation. For our example, even though the prior steps showed that this alternative would have an annual operating loss, the public benefits analysis shows that the public benefits far outweigh the capital and operating costs of the project through travel time savings, economic development, and air quality improvements from diverting passengers from airplanes and cars.
As we noted earlier, the elements of service planning that we just walked through are necessary in order to support rational, informed decision-making, which will make the case that the proposed service would make a worthwhile investment. In order for service planning to achieve these objectives, its results need to be presented clearly and concisely in a service development plan, or SDP. The SDP lays out the overall scope and approach for the proposed service, and is prepared once you have chosen a preferred service alternative. The SDP presents the results of each of the elements of the service planning process. In particular, it highlights the interrelationships and dependencies between the various elements and demonstrates that all of these elements were addressed using a common and consistent set of assumptions and inputs.
While the SDP will generally focus on the preferred service alternative that you identified, it should also address how you made the decision to select that preferred alternative. When funded under an FRA grant, a completed SDP is presented to the FRA for approval as one of the key deliverables under the grant agreement. However, the true measure of success for an SDP lies in its ability both to support a successful application for funding to implement the proposed service and to serve as a guide to help meet the intended scope, schedule, and budget for the service.
The SDP is a living document, one that is updated up through the time the service is running. The project sponsor will use the information in the SDP to guide the project through subsequent site-specific environmental review, preliminary engineering, and beyond. The SDP itself will need to be updated in order to address situations where the subsequent work results in changes to previously defined assumptions or inputs.
Let's recap what we've learned about service planning. We learned that you start with just an idea for a new or improved service, and that through service planning, you refine that idea into a specific set of service characteristics which determine the resources required to operate the service. We learned the key elements of service planning, how they are interrelated, and how the service planning process is inherently iterative. Information learned in a later element may force you to revisit and revise assumptions that you made earlier in the process. And we learned how service planning is documented in a service development plan, which serves as the blueprint that will guide you throughout the rest of the project development process.
Thank you for joining us for the service planning video. For more information about service planning, please visit the FRA website and the links listed in the description section below. Thank you.